Part 3. Please watch Parts 1 and 2 first.
My name is Dr. Shaham Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist and I live and work in sunny London. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to.
I'll admit it, I thought it was quite cool when a company called Hunt-A-Killer was kind enough to sponsor this video. But I wasn't 100% sure what Hunt-A-Killer was until the boxes started showing up in the mail. There were 6 in total. 6 black boxes that were packed with evidence. Since the baby arrived a couple weeks ago, I haven't been sleeping much. But I'd be lying if I blamed my insomnia on Lucas. The truth is Beth is the cause of my sleeplessness. Her death, to be exact. A murder? Well, that's to be determined. But foul play is far from a popular opinion on the small-town island of Mallory Rock, where Beth and her death are viewed as mere accidents, faultless casualties to the blind will of the island. But who's who, and who knows what? If you want to know the secrets of Mallory Rock, you'll have to help Gwen find out what happened to her sister. We need to know the truth about Beth. So when you sign up to Hunt-A-Killer, you get these boxes shipped out to you. Every 6 boxes a new mystery arrives, and you become the detective all over again. Now you can play this as a group for game night or even lovebirds for date night, but other people only ever seem to get in my way, so I ride solo, and there ain't nothing wrong with that. Everything you see here came in the boxes, but the contents threw me off at the start. Hunt-A-Killer's supposed to be a game, but I found it hard to believe these things were just mock-ups. Like the items in the boxes looked and felt like evidence from an actual case. Within moments, I was completely immersed. There's suspects and witnesses plus puzzles and ciphers. With Hunt-A-Killer, it's real detective work. And they've collabed with hotshots like Nancy Drew, Agatha Christie, and even Blair Witch. And if you get stuck, you're not alone. There's a spoiler-free community of over 100,000 others like you if you need help. Oh, and one last thing. Part of the proceeds Hunt-A-Killer makes goes to an organization that solves actual cold cases in real life. You want to sign up, put your armchair skills to the test? Good. You're in luck. Go to huntakiller.com/disturbingtruth now and enter code disturbingtruth to get $10 off your first purchase. Dr. Das, welcome to The Disturbing Truth. I'm Mr. Black, or you can call me Justin, or Dr. Black's not bad. I have been known to be called Lord Black. I'm just saying, Lord Dr. Black would be a nice way to address me. Or
Professor
King.
Black, that's what I'll call you.
Oh, you got to hit me with the professor, didn't you? Nice. I'm very excited to talk to you. I love your YouTube channel. I was very, very lucky to stumble across it when I was researching this case about Peter Bryan. As we're on part 3 of the case here, I thought it'd be great to bring you in as someone who has actually worked at Broadmoor, where Peter Bryan was held. And I know you didn't work hands-on with Peter himself, but you definitely would have some insight into how things are run, the treatment someone like Peter might receive, and what Peter Bryan might have been going through in his brain at the time. So I guess we'll just start off the interview with my first question, which is Peter Bryan killed 3 people, and he ate one of them, and he had no remorse. So was Peter suffering from an antisocial personality disorder, or were his crimes solely committed through delusions caused by schizophrenia? And what's the sort of difference there?
Sure. Happy to answer those questions. Just wanted to say off the bat, thank you very much for having me on your channel. Mr. Black, it's an absolute pleasure, and I'm happy to share my insights. And as you said, I did work in Broadmoor myself, although it was several years ago. So to answer your question, I think there is probably a couple of things going on with somebody like Peter Bryan. So I think, first of all, it might be helpful to explain what antisocial personality disorder is.
Okay.
So a personality disorder is something that's entrenched, it's part of you. It's a flaw in your natural character. And antisocial personality disorder is when you lack empathy, don't care about the rights of other people, don't know or don't care about the difference between right and wrong, you're impulsive, you're aggressive. So people like this tend to be career criminals. They're drug dealers, thugs, people that go in and out of prison regularly, people that have really long prison records. criminal records. Whereas schizophrenia is a mental illness. So a mental illness is not the same as a personality disorder, because a mental illness is a change in your baseline normal persona. And schizophrenia's change specifically is psychosis. So you have these periods of psychosis. In theory, they're temporary periods, although some people never get cured. And in these periods, you're out of touch with reality. So you might suffer from delusions or hallucinations. Delusions are like fixed, unshakable beliefs. And very commonly in schizophrenia, particularly in the small proportion that go on to commit violence, who are the exact kind of people that I assess, they tend to be paranoid delusions. So things like people want to hurt you, or watching you, want to kill you, laughing at you, poisoning you, etc., and hallucinations. The most common form of hallucinations are voices, so hearing voices. So that's just to give you a bit of context and background. Now, to answer your question, what did he have? Obviously, I haven't had the benefit of assessing him in person, but I think it's probably likely that he had both. The reason I say that is because he's known to be a serial offender, and he's somebody that frequently got into trouble with the law, pushed boundaries even when he was in hospital. So that to me suggests a personality of somebody who's willing to offend and repeat his aggressive behavior as a pattern. But crucially in his case, and the very fact that he went to Broadmoor rather than prison, I think it was driven by psychotic symptoms. So I talked about paranoid delusions. I think, and again, this is speculation to a degree without assessing him, I think it's too random that he tried to eat the brains of the second victim and said that he would have done something similar to the third victim had he not been stopped. So I'm highly suspicious that he might have had grandiose delusions about eating the brains. So, for example, that it would give him special powers or special strengths. So I think it was a little bit of both. I think the antisocial personality disorder causes him to offend regularly in the background, and the schizophrenia made him do those insane things that he did when he committed his murder.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that actually sort of plays into the second question I had for you, which was, is it possible that Peter Bryan was, maybe a psychopath with an underlying mental illness? So that is something that's it's quite possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Psychopathy is like an extension of antisocial personality disorder. So psychopathy is like all of those things that I just mentioned: lack of empathy, lack of remorse, not knowing right or wrong, not caring about the rights of others. But it's more than that. It's also about charm and manipulation. So somebody that only has the antisocial personality disorder might be a career criminal, but they're not very good at disguising their natural selves. Whereas a true psychopath might be a career criminal, or, might be a really successful CEO, but they're really good at hiding in plain sight. So they can slip under the radar. They can be really charming. They can come across as normal.
Right. Okay. I actually didn't know that. That's very interesting. With someone who is, well, first of all, I saw a lot of confusion in my comments on previous videos about the difference between psychopathy and psychosis. Which are very different things. Maybe you could go into that for me a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So remember how I was saying before that antisocial personality disorder is a personality disorder. So that's an entrenched character flaw. Psychopathy is also that. So it's an extreme version of antisocial personality disorder. So that's entrenched in you. It's got to do with your upbringing, your previous relationships, your traumatic experiences. That's you. Doesn't mean say that people can't be cured or changed, whichever term you prefer, but it's entrenched. Whereas a psychosis, like schizophrenia, is stepping out. So it's a temporary period of being outside of yourself. And a psychosis is those things that I was mentioning before. So delusions and hallucinations are the two most common symptoms. So unfortunately, they sound quite similar, and as you say, they do get conflated and mixed up. But they're two completely different things.
Yeah, I've had quite warring debates in my comments about that myself. So it's possible to not be a psychopath or have antisocial personality disorder or some cluster B group condition and experience psychosis as well on top of that without one of those. Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. So you could have a personality disorder and never be psychotic in your entire life. Or if you've got a personality disorder, so you've probably heard of borderline, otherwise known as emotionally unstable, then you have an increased risk of flipping into phases of psychosis. So even though they're two separate entities, they can coexist, and having one slightly increases your chance of having the other.
Sure. And in Peter Bryan's case, you mentioned paranoia.
Yeah, I was speculating to a degree, but I think that his actions of killing somebody so cold-heartedly and then eating their brains, I wonder whether he had a delusion about eating their brains.
Yeah.
It just seems like such a random thing to do. So some sort of, as you say, grandiose delusions that, eating this brains will give me power. And there are actually some cultures that believe that, like cannibals and old tribal kind of cultures used to believe that. So it might have been based in something that he's read about or heard about in the past.
Yeah, well, that's a very good point, actually. I actually have read about a tribe who, when their elderly die, they will consume their flesh, almost as a way of having them live on with them. But it's not the same as, killing someone and cooking their brains. I mean, that's way outside the margin of that. But maybe he did read something. You're right. He could have possibly picked something up and went, because cannibalism is always kind of ritualistic, isn't it? It's not sort of, well, I don't know. I mean, maybe you could develop some taste for it and it just becomes part of, I don't know, that's beyond my comprehension. I read in a report that he actually, when he was younger, like his sister had described him as someone who, like, was always up for a laugh. He was his mother's favorite. There didn't seem to be any, really outstanding issues, but it seemed to develop more. And throughout that time, he would sort of lock himself in the room and not come out and stuff. What could that have been his schizophrenia developing?
Absolutely, I think so. So schizophrenia has exactly what I told you about the hallucinations and delusions. Those are positive symptoms, but it's also associated with negative symptoms. So negative symptoms of schizophrenia are things that are missing rather than things that are extra. So a lack of socializing, being really withdrawn, isolative, lacking speech, so they don't say very much when they have these negative symptoms, lacking communications. So absolutely what you're describing sounds like the negative symptoms of schizophrenia.
So this is something that, and I imagine that like a lot of things that people even say a phobia, that the more you avoid that situation, be it a social situation, it just adds to the load that you're carrying when it comes to the condition. Would that be correct to assume?
Yeah, I think so. I think if you've got negative symptoms of schizophrenia and you're avoiding socializing, then not only does it make it harder if you try and go against that pattern, but it also makes you more marginalized. So you're going to feel less comfortable when you go out in public, and it might feed into paranoid delusions. So if you genuinely believe in your head that people are talking about you or watching you, wanting to harm you, and then you avoid people, so if you don't have a supportive family who are encouraging you to go out and interact with people, then it's just going to feed into your delusions, your positive symptoms, and make them worse, I think. Yeah.
I wonder with Peter, when he said he had quoted saying, I get these urges. That was something he quoted saying. And I wonder if these urges were spurred on by voices that he heard. I wonder if he kind of, maybe he was hearing voices and he just didn't want to say it.
Yeah, it's very possible. I can't really know. I can't give you insights into that personally, I'm afraid, because again, I've not assessed him, and from my research, there's no details in terms of his medical records. But it's feasible. If you've got, he must have had a pretty serious psychotic illness to have done what he did, number one, to end up in Broadmoor, number two. So it's very feasible that he's hearing voices as well. Yeah.
Okay. And what role might have the drugs that Peter Bryan taken? What role may they have played in?
Do you know what drugs they were?
They mentioned marijuana and alcohol. Now, I'm a marijuana user myself. I'm quite a vaping enthusiast when it comes to marijuana. I can't imagine wanting to eat someone after that, but I don't have a medical condition that would put me in the realms of paranoia or.
So my thoughts on marijuana, cannabis, and psychosis is this: I think the vast majority of people that smoke cannabis or consume it in any form are safe, and there's no issues with their mental health. But unfortunately, there's a small proportion of people who either get a drug-induced psychosis, so that's when they flip into something like schizophrenia from taking certain drugs. Marijuana, particularly skunk, is renowned for that. Amphetamines is renowned for that. Other drugs aren't actually. So something like heroin, for example, downers, alcohol are not renowned for that. It just happens to be stimulants and THC. And that can flip them into temporary psychosis. And some people can have schizophrenia, and it can, as I said before, there can be temporary periods. So they're relapses. And when you get better, they're remissions. So it can flip you from a remission into a relapse. So for those people who have a clear diagnosis of schizophrenia or who have a strong family history, it is actually very risky. And I don't think there's any way of getting around that, really.
Okay, and alcohol. You said alcohol wouldn't be renowned for that. So
yeah. So getting extremely intoxicated in itself is not. It can cause relapses into psychosis, but it's quite unusual. So it's very rare for that to happen. However, if somebody's like a habitual drinker or an alcoholic, then that can lead to lots of other areas of social decline, as I'm sure you and your viewers will know. So everything from poverty to a lack of functioning to problems holding our job, family life. So those things can cause stress, which can flip somebody into psychosis. So it's more of an indirect mechanism than a direct mechanism. Okay. So getting drunk once is not going to flip you into psychosis. But if you're an alcoholic and you have all these problems and your life deteriorates, then that can contribute to you becoming psychotic.
Sure. That kind of reminds me of like what people experience when they have blackouts and stuff. There were a couple good books I've mentioned in a previous episode. I think when it was the episode about not Fidel Lopez. Yes, Fidel Lopez. Was it Fidel Lopez? Yeah, so Fidel Lopez disemboweled his girlfriend under the influence of alcohol. But then the thing is it would be very easy to get into that and maybe lose yourself and was it temporary insanity? But for me, it's the actions before and after that really spelled it out for me. What happened, and the lack of remorse and stuff post crime. It's like if I did something that I absolutely would never do to someone I love, the moment that I would snap back into reality and be back in control of the spaceship, let's say. I don't think I would survive long. I think it would be very, very quick that I would end my own life. I would be. I mean, if I was like totally outside myself and did stuff I couldn't remember and suddenly was back in my body, I'm not a religious person at all, but I think I would think I was possessed by a demon and I would want to be locked up and never let out again. So
yeah. Can I tell you a story about a patient of mine?
Sure.
It's a little bit dark, so I apologize.
No, look, we are a dark channel, so.
Okay. So I've actually made a video about her on my channel, and I've written about her in my book. So I call her Yasmin Khan. That's not actually her real name, but she was a young 18-year-old girl who was one of the very first patients that I assessed as a psychiatrist that I had to give evidence for in a court case at the Old Bailey, which is a big court in London. And basically what happened is, unlike most of my patients, she's got no history of offending, no history of getting in trouble with the police, no history of mental health problems. And she was like quite a well-behaved, well-mannered young 18-year-old schoolgirl. And she became psychotic completely out of the blue. And she changed over the space of a couple of weeks, and she was acting a bit bizarrely, but certainly not violent in any way. And she ended up smothering and killing her 3-year-old nephew. So she, in this state of psychosis, she covered him with a pillow because she genuinely believed that he had demons inside of him and that she was getting.
I think I've heard of this case actually. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, and she didn't try and hide it at all. So her mother, the baby's grandmother, came around within a couple of hours, and she explained fully what she did. The police came around, and she kept insisting that she was going to resurrect this boy when she took demons out of him when the full moon was coming up. And then she ended up obviously going to prison, and I assessed her in prison. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is because exactly what you're talking about happened. So she was very prickly and very guarded and evasive when I first assessed her because she was psychotic. She was suffering from this psychosis. We found out later she wouldn't disclose it at the time, and she had all these really paranoid ideas. And it took months to medicate her to the point that her psychosis resolved. I had to give evidence to get her into hospital rather than prison because the prosecution wanted her to have a life sentence in prison. And once she was on our medium secure unit, it took about 18 months to stabilize her on medication. And then exactly what you're talking about happened. So it seeped into this entire time. She had her own delusional beliefs about what happened. And it took this long of medicating her before she actually realized what she'd done and reality set in. And as you'd imagine, she got really, really depressed. I don't think she was ever suicidal. At least she never expressed that, but she was really, really upset. She was part of the rehabilitation was to do family therapy. So I'd be sitting in a room with her and her brother, who's the father of the young boy that she killed. And as you'd expect, she just racked with shame and guilt. And part of her rehabilitation was treating the depression and getting her through this family therapy as well. So I completely understand what you're saying. I've seen it happen with my own eyes. It is tragic. The consequences of mental illness, although very rare, can be absolutely devastating.
Yeah, I mean, and I suppose for me that we would be totally in agreement up until a certain point, but we're going to get to that obviously. But we'll just run along with the questions I've got here, and I'll try not to jump too far ahead because I'm excited to talk to you about that part of it specifically. So. One thing about Peter as well is that he was sexually aggressive from a young age, and during the murder and desecration of Bryan Cherry, Peter admitted wanting to escalate his crime to a sexual level. So what role did sexual fantasy play in Peter's violent tendencies, and where might they have come from? I mean, could we be looking at something else there where it was like, okay, maybe he had some psychopathy, maybe he had an underlying disorder, and then also maybe there was some abuse that maybe triggered the psychopathy that he was experiencing.
Yeah, I have to say there would be a high degree of speculation in me answering this question because I've not assessed him in person. But when you were saying that, I thought exactly the same thing. I was wondering whether there was some sort of abuse, because my understanding is that there were other family members that allegedly had been involved in sexual abuse. So I think that's part of it. I think it's very likely that when people experience sexual activities before they're psychologically mature enough to really understand what they are, then they carry those patterns. So they completely don't understand the normal kind of boundaries and normal healthy physical relationships. And that often turns into people who are sexually abused themselves becoming abusers. So I wonder whether that's part of that. And another potential symptom of psychosis, so when he was stepping out of reality, can be like these strong sexual urges. So what I don't know and what I'd be really interested to know was whether he was sexually frustrated, or even whether he would offend sexually when he was well, or whether it happened only when he was psychotic. So did it only happen when he was in this sort of murderous rage, or was he having fantasies outside of that in periods of remission? Afraid I don't know the answer to that. I wouldn't be able to know until I saw the medical reports or assessed himself, but that would be the key to knowing whether it is part of his psychosis or not.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose with him, I look at that part of it from the start when he was sexually aggressive to his peers from young ages. I look at that and it kind of reminds me of Luis Garavito, Pedro Alonso Lopez, even Beth Thomas, the little girl from Child of Rage. She was experiencing what did they? Let me look that up. Jamie, can you pull that up? No, I'm not Joe Rogan. Okay, I'll look at it myself. Beth Thomas, I want to say it was called RAD. Yeah, okay, so Beth Thomas was a little girl. She was, I'm actually going to cover this in a video, but she was a little girl. They did a documentary on her, I guess, and I'm going to guess and say 89 the documentary came out. And they just interviewed her for 20 or 30 minutes, and she had been through serious abuse from her biological parents, her and her little brother. And we're talking, this is how young it can sink in, as you would know yourself. We're talking, I think she was under the age of 2, but what had happened to her carried on. So when she was adopted by a new family that didn't know her history at all, or how her and her brother were found, they didn't, know what was going on whenever the little boy was being hurt constantly and waking up, with pain and crying, and it turned out that she was sneaking out of her bed at night and trying to kill him. And this is a little girl. At that time, I guess she was 3 or 4, but she dealt with what they called reactive attachment disorder. And in order to correct it, what they had to do was sent her to a place where basically they took away all of her options, or all of her freedom was gone. She was not allowed to have freedom of choice anymore for, I think she was there 8 months before they finally broke through, and she started to show signs of empathy. She had none. Like, she had no, she didn't, expressing love, it was like love was absent from this little girl. And I wonder if Peter maybe would have been dealing with something similar that never got treated like hers did. It's interesting, as you say. It would be nice to know family history, what happened. It's a shame sometimes that cases like these, that they lock that stuff away.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is because no matter how heinous the crime they've committed, when you get people that go into places like Broadmoor, they are patients. So in terms of patient confidentiality, the actual hospital or the people that treat them are not allowed to reveal their private symptoms, et cetera, et cetera. I think because they're seen as vulnerable. Even if he has killed people, he's also seen as somebody that suffers from a mental illness, and in his psychotic state is acting in a way that's not his normal self, I guess. So they're seen as vulnerable, and that's why a lot of this information is available.
Do you think that the cannibalism part was maybe conflating with the sexual fetish towards the end? Could that have been possible?
I mean, it's quite hard to see how those things tie up, really, isn't it? They're both so sort of unusual. I think it's possible. I mean, it could just be that he felt disinhibited when he was psychotic, and part of that disinhibition was these sexual urges, and another part of the psychosis was the grandiosity of eating the brain tissue. Does that make sense? So they're not necessarily connected in the same symptoms, but they both occur in this state of psychosis. I think that's the most likely explanation.
It would have been really interesting to find out if he was being, in his mind, being instructed to do these things, or if, I mean, it certainly seemed like he enjoyed it. Broadmoor Hospital's known for housing some of the most notorious mentally unstable criminal patients the world has ever known. Working in a facility such as this, what behaviors would you encounter on a day-to-day basis? Like, I mean, you must be prepared for anything going into a facility like that. You have to, because it's unpredictable, isn't it, really?
Yeah, it is. So I worked in Broadmoor. It was about 7 or 8 years ago. I did most of my training in medium secure units, so I'm much more used to that environment. And Broadmoor is a high secure unit, as you know. So the first thing that struck me was just the level of security going in. So medium secure units, you're kind of pat down search, and you go through a metal scanner, and that's it. But in Broadmoor, you actually go through an airport style, like full security, like going through the metal detector gates. And in Broadmoor, you carry alarms, which you do in medium secure units, but there's also extra security like CCTV. There's actually a security team. So that's the first thing that struck me, was that just the whole place is geared to deal with violence and has a high level of security. And I have to say, and this tends to surprise people, that paradoxically, I think I felt more safer in Broadmoor than I did in medium secure units, because where I worked was the high dependency unit. So there's like a hierarchy of how acutely unwell or how violent the patients are. And in the place where I worked, because the patients were so unwell, so typically they'd committed multiple murders. So someone like Peter Bryan would be a perfect example of this. So when they've just done that, so they've come straight from prison or straight from the police station, and they're there for maybe a year or two until they're well enough to move to an open ward. So because of that, most of them were kept in long-term seclusion. So the difference between a high secure hospital and a prison would be that a hospital is there for rehabilitation. So everybody there is being medicated, being treated, and there is some impetus to try and move them on so they eventually leave. Whereas in prison, you just kind of lock people up. They might get medication, they might sometimes get rehabilitation, but they might not. They might literally stay in their cells 23 hours a day. But with Broadmoor, you're trying to push people to get better and to make them safe to go into society. So the thing that really struck me was that unlike any other ward in the hospital, the ward that I was on, they were in long-term seclusion. So most of them were actually in their cells for most of the time. Sorry, I shouldn't say cells, they're rooms. And there's lots of big plastic windows. And when I was going to speak to a patient, they would sit quite far away from me. and there would be one member of nursing staff whose only role it would be to sit down and watch the two of us to make sure that nothing happened and everybody had alarms. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that even though the clientele in there are the most mentally unwell and the most dangerous psychiatric patients, I actually felt safer, because the other places where I worked in medium secure units, you can walk onto a ward and there's patients kind of milling around in and out of their rooms. There's a lot less restriction and a lot less control. So it's oddly kind of calm working in Broadmoor. And, people ask me about it and I tell them that they expect the opposite. They expect it to be sort of chaotic and violent, but it is because they expect violence and they're so geared up for it. There's actually very little that happens. Plus the level of staffing's way more in terms of proportion of staff to patients in Broadmoor. So it'd be like one patient to something like, 3 members of nursing staff for one patient on the ward, whereas in medium secure units, it's like 10 nursing staff to one patient on the ward. So it's a lot more chaotic in medium secure units.
So in a medium secure unit, there would be the patients would outnumber the staff. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, they outnumber the staff in both in high secure and medium secure, but the proportion's different.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's what I meant. So in medium security, they much more outnumber. Is that correct? Okay, fair enough.
And the other main difference is in the medium secure unit, there's a lot more free flow, so people are coming and going with the patients as much as they want. Whereas in Broadmoor, in the high secure unit, if somebody's going to a group or somebody's going to going to the food hall, like there's the staff get ready and there's a protocol, so they line up, they open the door. It's a bit like when you see like maximum security prisons in the States, when they're moving prisoners, they're all kind of chained up. I mean, they're not actually chained up, but the process of moving them is actually organized, and so there's a lot more security and safety put on the patient's movements.
Have you ever encountered a patient that was feigning or faking symptoms of mental illness in order to alleviate criminal responsibility or likeness? And have you ever come across that yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So it generally tends to be not in these secure units that I'm talking about. It generally tends to be when I work as an expert witness, when I'm assessing them for their court case. So somebody that's on remand in prison, occasionally on bail, but more often on remand in prison. So I'll go and see them in prison or in the court. And yeah, I'd say it happens at least 3 or 4 times a year. I see a patient who I think's either completely fabricating or exaggerating their symptoms to get leniency, or because they hope that they're going to be transferred to a psychiatric unit rather than a prison. And it's really easy to spot. And I explain why. So the first thing that I do is I look in detail at all of the evidence. So I don't just take what's in front of me as given. I look in the old medical records, psychiatric reports, criminal history. So I try and find out if they've got a history of mental illness and how their functioning's been recently. So somebody who's psychotic, like we were talking about before, we're talking about becoming isolated and withdrawn. If that has happened, you'd expect there to be some sort of trace in it, trace in their documentation. Whereas if they've been working normally, socializing, going out and living a normal functional life, and then suddenly out of the blue, they're saying that they've turned psychotic, then I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm certainly very suspicious. And the other thing is that I when you actually see them in front of you, people who are genuinely psychotic generally are a bit paranoid and a bit evasive. So they've never met me before. I come in with a suit and they won't, they might be polite, but they won't really necessarily open up. I really have to tease out their psychotic symptoms and their paranoid beliefs. Whereas somebody who's trying to fake it, they're not very good actors. So they will come in and try and persuade me almost immediately. Like before I've sat down, they'll be like muttering to these voices they're supposedly hearing, or they'll make really paranoid comments about, can you see that person watching us, blah, blah, blah. Do you know what I mean? So if you were really paranoid, you wouldn't share it with somebody you just met. Whereas if you're trying to fake it, then their agenda is too obvious for me.
But if you were a psychopath and you're great at blending in, could you not use that as a skill to your advantage in that situation?
Yeah, I think that's feasible, to be honest. If you're a psychopath and you're really good at acting, I think you have to have that.
Isn't it the same thing?
A psychopath's really good at blending in.
Yeah.
No, you're right. You're actually right to a degree. A psychopath's good at blending in, so you're right about that. But they might have seen maybe one or two psychotic patients in their life, and they might have seen a film like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. They might have seen, you know, some documentaries or some Hollywood interpretations, which are often a bit lurid and unrealistic. But I've seen, you know, 1,000 actually psychotic patients, so I know what it really looks like. They know what the public thinks it looks like, if you know what I mean.
Of course.
So I guess my answer to your question is psychopaths can do that. But they often fail, and the reason that they fail isn't because they're not crafty enough or not manipulative enough. It's because they don't actually know what it really looks like.
Okay, so they're actually succeeding to emulate what they are setting out to emulate. Just you're ahead of the game on that. It's not Jack Nicholson or Jack Nicholson. Jack Nicholson, yeah. That's not the golfer, is it? No, it's Jack Nicklaus. Which one is it? Hold on. That's the actor. Wow. That's a One Flew Over My Cuckoo's Nest today, I think. Yeah. So how is diminished responsibility assessed in cases like Peter Bryan's? I mean, is there a criteria or like a certain range of tests that you'd conduct, and like what's the time frame for something like that?
Yeah, good question. So absolutely there are criteria. So diminished responsibility, just for the knowledge of you and your viewers, the two things often get mixed up. There's not guilty by reason of insanity, which is any offence. And if you get that legal finding, then you're completely innocent in the eyes of the law. So
that's guilty by reason of...
Not guilty by reason of insanity.
Okay. Oh, right. Okay.
So that means you're completely exonerated. Doesn't mean you're let free, because you might end up going to a psychiatric hospital like Broadmoor.
So that must be something similar to Vince Lee and the Greyhound bus beheading. Are you familiar with that case? It was Canadian. I actually did a story on it. It was called The Devil on Bus 1170, where a guy quite literally became psychotic on the bus, which I do believe that is what happened. He became psychotic on a bus and stabbed and killed a guy, and then the rest of the passengers. It was a full bus. They unloaded off the bus. Authorities came, but he wouldn't let him on the bus, and the guy was dead. He beheaded him and began to just eat the guy raw in front of everyone. And they took him in, and I don't think he got diminished responsibility. I think he got not guilty by... well, no, maybe it was diminished responsibility, because they tied it to schizophrenia that he didn't know he had, and then he was out in 3 or 4 years, and they gave him a new name, and I kind of need to know which one that was. So if you're not guilty by reason of insanity, would that be connected to schizophrenia? Could that be connected to schizophrenia?
Yeah. So either of the two defenses can be connected to any severe mental illness. So not guilty by reason of insanity is for any crime, and you're completely exonerated. Doesn't mean you're let free. You might have to go to a psychiatrist. You might still be sectioned or committed, as you'd say.
But it wouldn't be on a record then. Is that correct?
But it wouldn't be on your criminal record.
Okay, so that's what happened with Vince Lee. So.
Okay, and then diminished responsibility is only for murder, so no other offence, only murder, and it downgrades it to manslaughter. So it's saying you're responsible to a degree, but your level of responsibility is decreased, is diminished. So instead of being murder, because you fully didn't know what you're doing, you still killed somebody and you're partly responsible, but you didn't fully understand what you're doing. So now it's manslaughter instead, which has much lower sentences. There are legal criteria for both of them. I won't go through them because they're quite lengthy and quite boring and dull, but they're very specific. So somebody like myself, a forensic psychiatrist, would be asked to go through all the evidence and see whether their symptomatology match up with the legal criteria. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And in terms of how long it takes, so it kind of depends on the complexity, but generally speaking, they'd send me like the case papers, CCTV footage, witness statements, etc. So that would take me probably a day or two for a complicated case to get through. Then I'd see the patient either in prison or in court for maybe 2 hours, and then I'd write up my own report, which takes probably about another day. So I can do up to 1 or 2 cases a week if I've got a high workload.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, and a lot lies in your hands when you. I mean, you are, in a sense, you could be playing God with these decisions. You know, these aren't light decisions. As it in the case of Vince Lee, one of the things I found odd is that well, first of all, the legal system all kind of agreed, from like prosecutor to his own legal counsel, everyone kind of agreed that he was insane at the time, so they made the case like a closed to the public case, and the witnesses of the incident and families didn't even get to deliver testimony, which I found was very odd. It was kind of like they just immediately assumed that he was not guilty by reason of insanity. And that guy's out walking around and doing his thing. And
so I think something that I get asked about, or something that I've certainly heard, is that some people think that this would be a perfect example where somebody's done something that's so heinous that if they had gone to prison, they would have got a long prison sentence, right? They've probably been like 7-10 years, maybe even longer. But when they go to, some people, when they go to hospital, not all, they get rehabilitated fairly quickly. So in the space of 2 or 3 years, that girl that I was talking about, Yasmin Khan, who smothered and killed her nephew, she was in hospital for about 4 years altogether. So I think there is some people in the public where there's a bit of a public outcry, and they think that the person's not been punished enough. But the whole point of it is that the hospital admission is not about punishment. It's about rehabilitation. So if you're able to, if their actions were committed by these psychotic symptoms or driven by these psychotic symptoms, and you can take them away through medication, therapy, rehabilitation, and it takes different lengths of time for different people, depending on, compliance to medication, side effects, blah, blah, blah. But what I'm saying is that it's completely feasible that some people can get better very quickly. And crucially, they're safe at the point of discharge. So somebody who's antisocial or who's a psychopath who kills out of anger, who kills because they can't control their temper, might go through a 10-year prison sentence, but they could still be quite dangerous potentially at the end of that. Whereas somebody who's not a naturally antisocial person or not criminogenic, like Yasmin Khan, my old patient, who gets rehabilitated and get those symptoms taken away, it might take a short period of time, but at least theoretically speaking, they're much safer at the point of discharge as long as they take their medication. Once they're out of hospital, they're very, very unlikely to commit violence again.
Sure, and that was the argument that was used in the Vince Lee case, but for Peter Bryan, he didn't, smother a kid because he thought there were demons in them. Peter Bryan killed and ate a person, fully admitted his intentions to do it again. So how would you go in this case? In his case, how would you go? What would be your starting block to really rehabilitate someone like him?
So it's certainly possible, but it'd be a very kind of slow process. You'd have to do extremely carefully, especially considering that he's killed people in the past. So what I would do, first of all, is observe him. So I'd probably not give him any medication for at least 2-3 weeks, maybe even a month. So I want a really clear picture of what his symptoms are when he's psychotic. So I'll be very...
Sorry to interrupt you there, but
sure.
But he was masking those quite clearly several times, and was quite good at it. It seemed like.
I think that's even more the reason why you need to watch him in his natural state of mental illness. So you need to know if he's paranoid, if he's able to mask it to a degree. I mean, I'm sure he did mask them, but I would argue that a good psychiatrist would know how to kind of ask the right questions and scratch the surface to get at least an indication of some of those symptoms. I think that's entirely possible. So I would, as well as observing myself, I would get the nurses on the ward to observe him very carefully, to see his interactions, to see if he's breaking boundaries, if he's being aggressive. And then once you get a picture of what his baseline state is that you're working from, I trial him on a few different types of antipsychotic medications. And again, if he's really evasive and guarded, if he's not somebody that's going to tell me what he's thinking and the delusions that he's suffering, if he's somebody that's good at masking his symptoms, I'll be looking at all the other external indications of what his behavior is like. So again, his interactions with patients, et cetera, and then he would have to go through a long-term therapy. So a psychologist, as opposed to a psychiatrist, would sit with him regularly, really try and deep dive what was going on through his head, what he can remember, what the triggers were, whether that was drug and alcohol use, not taking his prescribed medication, being in certain social circumstances. And I'll take my time doing that with somebody this risky. I wouldn't be rushing it. I'd be doing it over months, if not years. I would also look at opportunities like educational, vocational opportunities, because if we eventually discharge him out in the community and you don't set him up to make a legitimate living, then you're just sort of setting him up to fail, basically. So I'd look at either educational opportunities, giving him qualifications, or training him up in something that he can work as after he's leaving. And if he was stable for a long period of time, I think for someone like Peter Bryan, when the risks are so high, I'm talking an exceptionally long period of time, like 3 or 4 years on the ward without any kind of aggressive incidents, then I'd start testing him on leave. So that might just be half an hour of leave inside the hospital grounds, accompanied by a nurse. If that goes well, then further afield, accompanied by a nurse. And then eventually unescorted leave, so maybe just half an hour at a time outside of hospital, but it'd all be structured, so he can't just go out and hang out in the park. It'd have to be for a reason, whether it's like a job interview or voluntary work or going to an internet cafe. And I test him out on leave by gradually increasing it over time. And if there were any issues with his behavior or any kind of indications of risk, then I'd probably curtail his leave and prolong his admission. But if he managed to get through it and stick to the boundaries, then eventually I think it's possible to discharge him. Yeah, so that's basically the kind of journey that most patients go through in the system.
And would your approach to that be the same if he had just come in from killing Nisha Sheth, or would it change if he had killed her, Bryan Cherry, and then the other guy too? Would that alter the way you would conduct your assessment of him?
Absolutely, it would. Absolutely. So, I mean, every single time he's taken somebody's life, he's become significantly more risky. So the process, the degree of observation,
and arguably better at it.
Yeah, well, I suppose it depends of the exact context. So, if it was, say, if he had these symptoms all along and they weren't medicated and he masked them, right? Say that's possibility A. Then I would be extremely worried about his future treatment, and I would be reluctant to discharge him anytime soon, possibly ever. I don't know. It's really hard to say without, actually treating him in person for many months. If, however, the problem wasn't that he wasn't masking his symptom, but that he wasn't taking his medication. So when he's taking his medication, he's relatively well and stable, and he's not having these psychotic beliefs. But when he stops taking his medication, then the psychosis comes in, and that leads to violence. So say scenario B, then I'm at least more confident that he can be kept safe if he takes his medication. And there are ways to enforce medication for patients in the long term. So the most obvious way is to give a depot injection kind of medication rather than tablets. And you can actually have a contract with somebody. In the UK, it's called a CTO, a community treatment order. So that means that they have to turn up once a month at the nurse's clinic to get this injection physically from the nurse. And if they don't, then they can be recalled into hospital. So I'm being a bit evasive in my answer, but there's so many sort of factors, so it depends on those factors. But theoretically, if it's just psychosis and if medication keeps him stable and in remission, then theoretically it's possible to keep him safe, I think.
That was actually the next question I had as well. It was, can he? So let's say it's a mental illness and drugs and alcohol are deemed to be the triggers for his psychosis. Let's say, can he? I know now that he can be forced to take the medication, or he has to go back inside for treatment. But can he also be forced into an alcohol and drug ban? Well, I mean, I suppose drugs are already banned, but can that be further enforced, like things like alcohol? Could they say, yeah, and you can't have alcohol either?
Yeah, absolutely they can. But it's a bit of a grey area in terms of how well you can monitor that. So there's a thing that I told you about is the community treatment order. There's also another thing called a restriction order in the UK. So it's for the most riskiest patients, the kind of people exactly that would go to Broadmoor. And it's similar to a community treatment order, but the difference is the Ministry of Justice also oversee the care of these extreme high-risk patients. And the psychiatrist, so the consultant psychiatrist such as myself, signs off on the conditions. And our conditions can be, as I said, he has to turn up to take his medication. As you said, another condition is that he's not allowed to drink alcohol or take drugs. The problem is enforcing that, right? So we can get him to come along realistically, maybe come along to see a nurse once a week, take his medication once a month, but also see a nurse once a week, maybe see a doctor once a month or two. And we can breathalyze him then, and we can do urine drug screen tests then to see if there's any drugs in his system. But the problem is if he's crafty enough, he can get around that. He can sort of drink in between or use drugs in between the times of the tests, or he can occasionally not turn up to his appointments. And the other issue is, say that we know that he's taken, say he tests positive for cannabis, or say he breathalyzes and we know he's been drinking. What do you do at that point if he's stable? Because you could say, well, he's breached his condition, so get him straight into hospital. And as a psychiatrist, I have the power to do that. But if he's not acutely unwell, what's the point? You put him in hospital to do what? You watch him for a couple of weeks, couple of months, maybe 6 months, and then you release him. Yeah, I suppose you could justify that. But in these units, especially a place like Broadmoor, there's such a demand for beds, and there's so many people in prison that are constantly acutely psychotic that need to come in for treatment, that it's just a balance is what it is. It's hard to know when to recall people into hospital or not. And you could very reasonably argue that someone like Peter Bryan is extremely high risk, so he needs to be brought in at the first sign of any danger. But Broadmoor's full of people that are dangerous, and there's not enough space for all of them. So that's part of my job, is to try and balance all of those risks together. So sorry, it's a bit of a waffling answer, but I suppose what I'm saying is yes, you can make a contract with patients, and you can enforce conditions like not drinking, not taking drugs, taking medication. That to settle the contract's not that difficult, but to actually enforce it and make sure it runs smoothly is a constant headache for something like me.
So, in my opinion, with someone like Peter Bryan, who's repeatedly offended, they've butchered and cannibalized people, they show full intent to do it again. Like, they're open about this intent. They're quite good at masking when they want to, but they kind of want to do this. I think they have a disease called monster, and they should never be allowed out. Unless, of course, you've got a cure for monster. I mean, is there a cure for this variation of the monster disease? Now I know exactly what you're thinking. You're like, uh-oh, the gloves just came off.
Anti-monster medication doesn't exist. Well, all right. Okay, so if you had somebody like Peter Bryan, and if I was in charge of his care, I would, how do I put this? I would always be looking to want to rehabilitate and discharge him. That will always be my intention, because I am a doctor, I'm not a prison officer. Now, if he made it impossible for me to do that, if he didn't take his medication or had really bad side effects from his medication, or if he was really aggressive on the ward, getting into fights all the time, or if he was stable on the ward and then was given leave, and the first thing he did when he got leave was run out and get drunk, and we had to get the police to bring him in. Trying to think of any other examples, if he was breaking other boundaries within the hospital, like bringing in illicit drugs, or I don't know, trying to take advantage of some of the female nurses, if he's doing any of those things, each one of those things would cause a massive alarm bells, and I would slow down or lengthen his admission in hospital. So instead of considering leaving 6 months, if he did any of those things, I would delay it for another 3 months, another 6 months. So I might not ever get there. And as I was saying to you before, some of the patients that I saw when I worked in Broadmoor in the high dependency unit never got there, and I don't think they'll ever leave hospital. So I guess what I'm saying is, depending on his progress, if he kept putting barriers up, I wouldn't be keen to take a risk of discharging him, because he's killed 3 people. I mean, that in itself makes him an extremely risky patient.
I mean, he killed 3 people, but even further into that, he killed someone in a secure facility. Now how the hell that happens is beyond me. Now, I did watch your other video with the other guy on this case, and I understand what you're saying. How can they all be watched all the time? And there was no indication that Peter wanted to do this, but it's the fact that at any moment he can find his opportunity and do it, even inside. And when you've got someone like that, I mean, this is different from. Okay, yeah, I'll be honest. The other girl you told me about who thought demons were in her nephew, I wouldn't let her out either, but I could understand more someone rehabilitating her via something that happened temporarily where your mind snapped. But with Peter Bryan, I'm sorry, I just don't see it as his mind snapping. I think his mind is constantly broken, and he loves it. It seems that he enjoys this, and I think if you let this guy out, you're going to end up with another half-eaten person laying on a floor somewhere. I genuinely believe that,
Okay, so that was one scenario. I said, if he put all those barriers in my way, then I would keep delaying it, and either he would die in hospital or I would retire as a psychiatrist and he'd never be released. However, if the opposite of that happened, if it was, and I could see clearly, and I'm not talking about like a snapshot, I'm not going to see him once and make an assessment. I'm talking over a long period of time. If I could be convinced, not from what he's saying, but from my own psychiatric expertise, that it was a psychotic, all in the context of a psychotic break. And he does flip in and out, and clearly he does flip in and out because he's done it more than once, hasn't he? And I'm convinced that I can control those symptoms with the right combination of medication and therapy. Then I can see, if everything aligned in a certain way, I can see a slow way to rehabilitation, and I would be looking to discharge him, because that's my job I'm a doctor. As I said before, I'm not like a judge or a prison officer. So that I can see a set of circumstances where I would discharge him. But it'd be, as I want to emphasize, it'd be a very, very slow, long, drawn out, thorough process. And after discharge, you'd have a high level of observations. And so I think this is somewhere where you and I are not going to see eye to eye.
Absolutely. Yeah, we definitely won't. But that's cool. That's fine. That's all. That's what life's about. I spoke to Dr. Mark Benecki at the end of the Luis Garavito video. Luis Garavito, if you're not familiar with him, is and I know guys like yourself and like Dr. Benecki hate when people say this too, but he is arguably the worst serial killer, mass murderer of all time. Quite easily. Look him up. Watch my video on him if you want. But when I spoke to him, we disagreed at the end when it came to this as well too, where I don't think that you can rehabilitate someone like Peter Bryan. Again, with the girl you mentioned, you probably are right. I just wouldn't let her out still because I'm an asshole. But I would understand where you're coming from with her, but not someone like Peter Bryan. Let me ask you this. So if, let's say you did assess Peter Bryan or someone like him, and you got all the results that you wanted, and you went, okay, I think that this is manageable and we can release this person now. After you've done your supervised short stays and everything that would come under that umbrella of what you would need to rehabilitate someone, and you go, okay, I think we've done it. I think this guy can be released. How much would you look over your shoulder for the victims' families?
So I will answer that. Before I answer that, just because I think it's important to put it into context, he wouldn't be sort of released completely into the wilderness on his own. He'd be almost certainly in a high supported hostel. So it's not a hospital and he can come and go as he pleases, but there will be staff members that would be observing him. I'd be either myself or the consultant working in the community in my team would be reviewing him on a regular basis. And he'd be turning up for medication to see the nurses. So,
Sorry to interrupt again, but in his case, he's kind of already went through that and he broke that too. So that would be a tough one to kind of argue there, in my opinion. But how would you, when you make, let's say you made a decision like that, maybe you have had to make decisions like that. What goes through your mind when you think about the victims of these people, their family members? What goes through your mind? Do you feel any sort of guilt, or how does that hit you? It must hit your heart a little bit. It has to.
I suppose. So the one thing I'd say is that the victims are involved to a degree. They don't have any decision-making capabilities, but they're informed. So they're informed when somebody's being discharged from hospital. They're informed when somebody's getting leave from hospital as well. So it wouldn't be us, but the ministry would tell the Ministry of Justice. The Ministry of Justice would write to them. So they're in the loop to a degree. Although, as I said, they can't influence the consultant's decision. I suppose I don't feel a degree of guilt. Well, obviously, I feel an empathy and a sadness and a sorrow for what's happened. I don't feel guilt myself, because the very fact that they've come to me in the first place has meant that there has been an assessment, either by myself or one of my colleagues, that has deemed that this person's offence was either fully or at least partially driven by mental illness. So if it is somebody who was just a psychopath and had committed a heinous crime outside of mental illness, they wouldn't even be under my care in the first place. They would be going to prison. So by the very nature that I'm involved in their rehabilitation, there is a degree of mental illness that's caused their offending. And if I'm confident that they're safe at that point, then I can sleep easy at night. And there's no pressure. Well, I was going to say there's no pressure in me speeding up that process. I mean, in reality, there is, because, as I was saying before, there's always a pressure on beds, and there's only a limited number of beds, and the hospital managers want you to move people on. But Despite that, it is ultimately my decision. So it's literally my name that's signed off on the paperwork. And the point I'm trying to make is I would never sign that piece of paper until I thought that patient was safe. And even if that meant them being on leave for a year or 2 years, and if they've shown some aggression whilst they're on leave, having their leave revoked, or if they've broken the boundaries, having their leave revoked and starting back from the beginning. So I've already gone, before I sign that discharge document, they've gone through a process where I can be as sure as I can be that they're safe. That's not to say that they're 100% safe and that nobody will ever go on to reoffend, because they absolutely do. But it's all that we have within our resources to make them as safe as they can be. Because if you don't do that, if you don't discharge them, then there's no point in them being in a hospital, in my view. You might as well just send them to prison. There's no point in having forensic psychiatrists or having, this kind of service available. If you don't need to rehabilitate them, if you just want to lock them up indefinitely, then I don't think this, but if that's the way that society thinks, then you should just have a life sentence for everybody that commits a serious crime and just put everyone in prisons and incarcerate them. There's no point in having rehabilitation unless there's an end point to make them reintegrate into society.
Well, you have a point there, definitely. But I would go further than that, and I would say that it's not just about locking them up for life. I do think Peter Bryan should be locked up for life. I think, but maybe not in a penitentiary. I think there's a lot that could be learned from someone like Peter Bryan. Pardon me. Luis Garavito is another one who's locked up. We could learn a lot from a guy who's killed 350 children and tortured them to death, slowly, and the most ridiculous ways you can't even imagine. We could learn something from them about why this is happening. So I think facilities would be great for that. I just don't believe that we can always rehabilitate some of these people, Peter Bryan being one of those. And that's my unprofessional opinion, fueled by torches and pitchforks. So, but I listen. I do appreciate what you do, 100%. And I think without guys like you, I said it about Dr. Mark Benecki too. Without guys like you, people like me don't get a better understanding, and that's why I wanted to bring you on the show, because you can help me understand. It doesn't mean that we're going to agree on everything, but definitely helps me understand the process and how you assess someone like this and what to look out for. But as you said, we are going to disagree on the releasing them. I would conclude with, if you were to, and obviously your assessment of, say, Peter Bryan would be peer reviewed in a sense. It's not just like you saying, okay, he's good to go. Which
kind of. So you have an MDT, a multidisciplinary team. So you have on your team junior doctor, psychologists, occupational therapists, nurses, but it is the forensic psychiatrist's ultimate decision.
Oh, right, okay.
So it's peer reviewed in that you regularly have meetings with all these people in the teams, and they regularly meet with all the patients. So everybody should be on the same page, and a good psychiatrist will have his team on board and will have their kind of blessing and their agreement before they let somebody go on leave or discharge them. But it is ultimately our responsibility. So if you were going to be a dick about it, you could just go against the rest of your team's intuition and sign them off. Like there's nothing legally stopping me from doing that, but I personally wouldn't do it.
Yeah, of course. And I suppose what potentially could have happened in Peter Bryan's case is he got what you would call not a good psychiatrist. Because he was taken at face value for the things he was saying. It didn't seem like he was properly assessed. Perhaps you would have done a much better job at that. Let's say, for instance, to conclude that you've assessed Peter Bryan and you've come to the conclusion that he's no longer a threat. He doesn't want to eat any more people. You go, we can let this guy go. We're gonna monitor him, make sure he takes his medicine and sees his therapist and whatever else needs to fit in there. What if I were to say to you, okay, that's fine, but Peter Bryan sleeps at your house for the next 2 years? honestly, what would and look, it still doesn't mean that we have to agree. I'm not trying to change your mind, but I just wonder.
I'd be happy with that.
You would be happy with it?
How much rent's he paying? No, absolutely not. No, of course I wouldn't be happy with that. No. But yeah.
I appreciate your honesty there.
Yeah, I've got kids in the house as well.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's what you've just displayed there. I think is the separation from your profession and what you do professionally, which is a great entity. It's a true credit to the world. But then also, as you said, you're a dad. So, and that's what I meant earlier about how it must affect. I mean, I don't have anybody who's there's no Peter Bryan in my family tree that's killed anyone in my family tree, so I can't really say how that would feel. But I imagine they would feel something similar to what you just expressed there when you said, "No, I've got kids in the house." So
having said that, I'm going to put a little twist on this.
Okay.
If it was this is a pretty dark thing to say, but hypothetically speaking, if it was one of my own kids that had done something like that, I think I would give them the benefit of the doubt. If it's my own kids, I would.
That's
and they commit something heinous and had taken life in the context of mental illness and was cured, I would take that risk because it's my own kids.
That's very interesting. Yeah. Yeah, that is definitely a little twist there. Let me process that for a second.
I guess what I'm saying is I'm willing to take more of a risk.
Sure.
I'm willing to take less of a risk if my family is potentially under threat, and conversely, I'm more willing to take a risk with my own family members if they were in that situation. Yeah,
that's a really good way. That's a really nice thing to put on there. I think I would do the same. Which is a double standard for sure, 100%. Admittedly, a double standard, but yeah, I think I would do the same. And I think actually, Peter Bryan's parents did something similar for him the first time after he killed the girl. They took him in. Yeah, very, very strange. And with what happened with Peter Bryan, I mean, we haven't really touched on it too much, but then the third murder that he committed, I think you probably agree that should have never happened, especially there was definitely a failure there within the system. And you would like to think that they work through that and fix it in the UK and that doesn't happen again. But then obviously we had Richard Huckle a couple of years later, so it can happen. But as you say, that's just down to not enough staff to man that many people. I mean, you can't.
Yeah, and it's a bit of a controversial thing to say, but also how effective or how good the staff are at doing their jobs. So the person in charge of the treatment can write half-hour observations or 15-minute observations, but this is hypothetically speaking. I can't speak to what actually happened in these cases, but if a member of staff is on a night shift and they're falling asleep and they're not checking in on the patients, for example, then you can have the best systems in place, but they're only as fallible as the people that are in the staff that are working those systems, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, listen, I learned a lot today speaking with you, and that's why I like talking to guys like you that are professionals, because it ups my game, helps me with the next video. But we're never going to agree on rehabilitating people like Peter Bryan. I don't think it's possible. I think you're getting. That's
all right. We can disagree.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you as well, Mr. Black. And I like questions that are a bit challenging rather than sort of anodyne and easy to answer.
No, hey, it was a great conversation. I'd like to do this again. I've got a couple more cases in mind. And anybody watching, I did a big intro for you there to put people on just before we actually got on screen. But I would encourage any of my listeners to go and subscribe to your channel. You want to learn some stuff? This beautiful man in a blazer on the screen right now, he's got some great information on his channel, and I've been diving through it. I genuinely have. If you could see the many 2/3 red bars over here on your content that I've watched, it's very interesting, man. And hopefully we can do this again. I'd love to have you on again.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be a pleasure. And if your viewers are interested, I've done a whole series on high-profile ex-patients in Broadmoor. So people like Charles Bronson, you've probably heard of, the nail bomber, David Copeland. So if your viewers are interested, I've done a psychoanalysis on those individuals.
You also have done one, and I haven't watched it yet, but I want to. The twins in the UK, they were from Sweden or somewhere, I think.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
I can't wait to hear what you had to say about that. That was a very interesting case. The girls that kind of threw themselves into traffic.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's unique about that is it seems like it's a very rare case of folie à deux, and it's like split psychosis. So one person becomes psychotic and then somebody else gets those exact beliefs. So these two women were literally jumping in front of traffic on a busy motorway. And incredibly, it was all caught on camera because there was a cop show that was being recorded at that time. So there's literally like cameramen watching these girls jump in front of trucks. It's insane. Not just jump in front of trucks, but I vividly remember one of them going under the wheels of a lorry, and then like a semi. If you're American, a lorry is a semi. Like an 18-wheeler just went over the top of her, like over her. And she still got up and was fighting off the cops. I mean, this was now obviously that this is a topic for another discussion on the channel. But definitely, guys, if you want some good content and you're sick of waiting on me to put out videos every other month, you need to go over to this man's channel. It's called Psych For Sore Minds, and he's just awesome. And he how have you only got? You're about to hit 15,000 subscribers. I don't understand how you don't have 150,000. Yeah, I ask myself that question every day, to be honest with you. But I've been going for about a year and a half almost, and I don't feel like I'm anywhere near my potential, but I'm just trying to keep slogging, basically. Look, you're doing great work, and I'm going to do my best to get some people over there for you, and then we'll come on, we'll do this again. Yeah, absolute pleasure, man. Thanks for coming on. Keep in touch, and let's do it again as soon as possible. Absolutely, I'd love to, and thank you again for having me on. It's a pleasure to speak to you. Hey, I appreciate it.
I know where you've been. I've tasted all your sin. It doesn't make a difference to me. Oh, there will never be a love for you like me. So please don't leave.
Mallory Rock. I'll never know what Beth saw on this miserable island. 6 weeks ago, her body washed up on North Beach.
It's Beth.
The cops think it was an accident. They said she fell from a bluff and drowned. There's only one problem. Beth was scared of heights, and I mean terrified.
My sister was murdered.
Front desk.
Hi, I was wondering if you could recommend a place for dinner.
Not really, no. Beth's life was a little messy, but I thought everyone liked her. Someone on the island wanted her gone. I'm sending you everything I can find. Evidence, clues, passwords, photos. I need your help to find out who killed Beth.
We commit Beth's body to the ground, its final resting place. Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust.
I can't keep going behind the chief's back with these things.
I know. I think I'm close here.
You are blinded by the good that you think you're doing. This could be good for both of us. And the island.
The thing about Mallory Rock is, everyone here is just a little off. We have to figure this out.
Sorry about your sister. This island can be so cold at times, you know?